The hospital corridor smelled of antiseptic and desperation. Victoria Hayes sat in the hard plastic chair outside the intensive care unit, her hands trembling as she clutched a worn photograph of her daughter. 8-year-old Penelope had been fighting a plastic anemia for 6 months, and every day brought her closer to the edge. The doctors had tried everything: transfusions, medications, experimental treatments, but nothing worked. Her bone marrow was failing, and without a transplant she had weeks left at most. Dr. Marcus Brennan had delivered the news that morning, with the practiced gentleness of someone who'd broken too many hearts. "We've searched the National Registry," he'd said, his eyes tired behind wire-rimmed glasses. "There's only one donor match for Penelope, one person in the entire database whose bone marrow is compatible with her unique blood type and genetic markers." Victoria had felt hope surge through her chest for the first time in months. "When can we contact them? When can we schedule the transplant?" The doctor had hesitated, and in that pause, Victoria's hope began to crumble. "That's the problem, Mrs. Hayes. The donor hasn't responded to our outreach attempts. We've sent multiple letters, made phone calls, but there's been no reply. Without their consent, we can't move forward." Now 6 hours later, Victoria sat alone in that corridor, watching nurses move past with purposeful strides, listening to the mechanical beeps and whirs of machines keeping people alive. Her ex-husband, Trevor, had stopped visiting weeks ago, unable to face the reality of their daughter's condition. Her parents were elderly and lived 3 states away. She had no siblings, few friends left after months of cancelled plans and ignored calls. It was just her and Penelope against the world, and she was losing the only battle that mattered. Inside the ICU, Penelope slept fitfully, her small body dwarfed by the hospital bed, tubes and wires connecting her to machines that monitored her weakening vitals. Her blonde hair, once thick and wild, had thinned to wispy strands that clung to her pale scalp. The vibrant, laughing child who'd loved painting and singing had become a shadow, too weak to hold a crayon, too breathless to hum her favorite songs. Victoria pressed her palm against the cold glass window, separating her from her daughter. "Please," she whispered to no one in particular, to God or fate or the universe. "Please let them say yes." "Mrs. Hayes?" She turned to find Dr. Brennan approaching, but he wasn't alone. Beside him walked a man Victoria recognized instantly, though she'd never met him in person. Everyone in Chicago knew that face. It had been on magazine covers, news broadcasts, and billboards across the city. Julian Westbrook, founder and CEO of Westbrook Industries, one of the wealthiest men in America. At 42, he was known for his sharp business acumen, his ruthless corporate strategies, and his intensely private personal life. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Victoria's car, but his dark hair was slightly disheveled, and his striking blue eyes held an expression she couldn't quite read, something between determination and vulnerability. "Mr. Westbrook asked to speak with you," Dr. Brennan said quietly. "I'll give you both some privacy." The doctor retreated, leaving Victoria alone with the billionaire. She stood awkwardly, suddenly aware of her wrinkled jeans and the coffee stain on her faded sweatshirt, the fact that she hadn't showered in 2 days or slept in her own bed in over a week. Julian Westbrook stepped closer, his gaze moving past her to the window where Penelope lay sleeping. For a long moment he said nothing, just studied the little girl with an intensity that made Victoria's breath catch. "Mr. Westbrook," she began, her voice hoarse from crying and exhaustion. "I don't understand why you're here." He turned to face her, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, pain, perhaps, or regret. When he spoke, his voice was deeper than she'd expected, rougher around the edges. "Because I'm the donor, Mrs. Hayes, the only match for your daughter." Victoria's legs nearly gave out. She gripped the back of the chair to steady herself. You're the one who hasn't been responding." "I received the first letter 3 weeks ago," he admitted. "I've been processing it, trying to decide what to do." Anger flared hot in Victoria's chest, momentarily overwhelming her shock. "Processing it. My daughter is dying, and you've been processing whether or not to save her life." He didn't flinch from her fury. "I know how this looks, but there are complications you don't understand." "Complications?" Victoria's voice rose, and a passing nurse glanced their way. She lowered it to a harsh whisper. "What complications could possibly justify letting an 8-year-old child die?" Julian looked back at Penelope through the window. "I've never been tested as a bone marrow donor before. I never registered for any database or gave permission for my genetic information to be used for matching." Victoria frowned, confused. "Then how did they find you?" 6 years ago I was in a serious car accident. I needed emergency surgery, blood transfusions. The hospital ran extensive tests, and apparently some of that data ended up in a research database that feeds into the transplant registry. I only learned about it when the first letter arrived. But you're here now, Victoria said, trying to understand. Does that mean you'll do it? You'll donate? Julian's jaw tightened. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a photograph, its edges worn as if it had been handled many times. He held it out to Victoria. She took it with shaking hands. The photo showed a young boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, with Julian's dark hair and blue eyes. He was laughing, his arms wrapped around a golden retriever, his face radiating pure joy. His name was Christopher, Julian said softly. My son. He died 9 years ago from leukemia. He was 7. Victoria's anger dissolved into something else entirely. She looked up at Julian and saw the raw grief etched into his features, the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He needed a bone marrow transplant too, Julian continued. We searched everywhere, tested everyone in our lives, expanded the search nationally and then internationally. But we never found a match. He died 6 weeks after his 7th birthday, in a hospital room that looked a lot like this one. I'm so sorry, Victoria whispered, the words inadequate but genuine. After he died, my wife couldn't cope with the loss. Our marriage fell apart within a year. I threw myself into work, built my company into an empire, convinced myself that success could fill the void he left behind. Julian's voice cracked slightly, but it never did. And when I got that letter 3 weeks ago, when I saw your daughter's name and age and diagnosis, it was like being pulled back into the worst moment of my life. Victoria handed the photograph back to him, her own eyes burning with tears. So you'll do it? You'll save Penelope? Julian looked at her, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he smiled. A small, sad smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I came here tonight to tell you yes. I'll donate my bone marrow, but there's something you need to know first, something that changes everything about this situation. Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs. What is it? Julian Westbrook took a deep breath, his blue eyes never leaving hers. I didn't just receive letters about a random match in the transplant database. The genetic markers, the blood type, the compatibility factors, they're not just close. They're perfect. Too perfect to be coincidental. He paused, his next words barely above a whisper. Mrs. Hayes, I think Penelope might be my daughter. Victoria staggered backward, her shoulder hitting the wall. The corridor seemed to tilt, and she had to press both palms against the cold surface to keep from sliding to the floor. That's impossible, she breathed. I don't know you. We've never met. Julian's expression remained steady, though his jaw was tight. Not directly, no, but 9.5 years ago, I was at a medical conference in Boston. The Fairmont Hotel on September 15th through the 17th. The blood drained from Victoria's face. She had been at that same hotel, working as the event coordinator for the pharmaceutical company sponsoring the conference. It had been her first major corporate job after finishing her degree, and she'd been so proud, so eager to prove herself. I was there on business, she said slowly, her mind racing backward through time. I was managing the evening receptions, coordinating with vendors, making sure everything ran smoothly. The gala on the second night, Julian said. September 16th. There was a problem with the audiovisual equipment during the keynote presentation. You fixed it in under 3 minutes, barely caused a ripple in the program. Afterward, at the reception, we talked. Victoria's memory sharpened, bringing that night into focus. She remembered now. A handsome man in an expensive suit, standing alone by the windows overlooking the harbor. He'd seemed different from the other executives, more genuine somehow. They'd talked for hours about everything except work. He'd told her about loving old bookstores and hating pretentious wine tastings. She'd shared her dream of opening a small art gallery someday. They'd laughed easily, comfortably, as if they'd known each other for years instead of hours. You said your name was Julian, she whispered. Just Julian. You never mentioned a last name, never talked about your company or your wealth. I didn't want to be Julian Westbrook that night, he admitted. My son had been gone for 6 months. My marriage was ending. I was drowning in grief and guilt, and I'd gone to that conference to escape my own life for a few days. When I met you, you made me feel human again. You made me laugh for the first time since Christopher died. Victoria closed her eyes, remembering the warmth of that connection, the unexpected intimacy of talking to a stranger who felt like an old friend. We spent the night together, yes. And then You were gone in the morning. I woke up alone, and you'd left nothing, no note, no phone number, nothing." The old hurt resurfaced, surprising her with its sharpness even after all these years. "I thought maybe I'd imagined how special it felt, that maybe it was just another one-night stand to you." "It wasn't," Julian said firmly. "I panicked. I woke up at dawn and realized I'd betrayed everything. My grief for Christopher, my failing marriage, my responsibilities. What we shared felt too good, too real, and I wasn't ready for anything real. So I ran. I've regretted it ever since." Victoria opened her eyes and looked at him. "I found out I was pregnant 6 weeks later. I tried to find you, searched for every Julian who'd attended that conference. But there were dozens and none of them were you. You'd registered under a pseudonym, hadn't you?" He nodded, looking ashamed. "Julian Marshall. My mother's maiden name. I used it sometimes when I wanted anonymity. I gave up searching after a few months," Victoria continued, her voice hollow. "I was alone, pregnant, terrified. My boyfriend at the time, Trevor, he knew I'd been unfaithful. But when I told him about the baby, he said he'd raise her as his own. We got married quickly." He signed the birth certificate. For 8 years, Penelope believed Trevor was her biological father. When did he leave? 2 months after Penelope's diagnosis. He said he couldn't handle watching her die, that it was too hard. Victoria's voice turned bitter. The man who promised to be her father walked away when she needed him most. Julian's hands clenched into fists again. "I would have been there. If I'd known about her, I would have been there from the beginning. But you didn't know, and I didn't know how to find you, and now—" Victoria's voice broke. "Now you're telling me that the only person who can save my daughter's life is her biological father, and you've been wrestling with whether or not to do it." "No," Julian said sharply. "I wrestled with whether or not to reveal the truth. The donation was never in question. The moment I saw her blood type, her genetic markers, the probability calculations, I knew, and I knew I would do whatever it took to save her." "Then why wait 3 weeks? Why make us suffer through the uncertainty?" Julian ran a hand through his hair, the polished businessman facade cracking further. "Because I needed to be sure. I hired a private investigator to look into your background, your history. I needed to confirm the timeline, verify that you'd been at that conference. When everything lined up, when I saw photos of Penelope and recognized my own features in her face, my son's smile in hers," his voice caught. "I had to decide how to handle this, whether to tell you the truth or donate anonymously and disappear from both your lives. And you chose to tell me why." "Because I'm tired of running," Julian said. "I ran from you 9 years ago. I ran from my grief, from my failed marriage, from every emotion that made me feel vulnerable. I built walls around myself so high that no one could get in, and I convinced myself that was strength. But it wasn't, it was cowardice." A nurse emerged from the ICU, glancing at them before continuing down the corridor. The interruption reminded Victoria where they were, why they were having this conversation. Inside that room, Penelope was dying. The metaphysical questions, the paternity revelations, the emotional complications, none of it mattered if her daughter didn't survive. "Will you still donate?" Victoria asked. "Even now that I know the truth?" "Yes, Dr. Brennan is scheduling the procedure for tomorrow morning. They'll harvest the bone marrow, and Penelope can have her transplant by tomorrow afternoon." Relief flooded through Victoria so powerfully that her knees buckled. Julian caught her arm, steadying her, and the touch sent an unexpected jolt through her system. Recognition, memory, something deeper. "Thank you," she whispered. "Whatever happens between us, whatever we decide about the future, thank you for saving her life." "There's more we need to discuss," Julian said gently. "After the transplant, after Penelope recovers, we'll need to figure out what this means. Whether you want me in her life, whether she should know the truth about her parentage." "I don't know," Victoria admitted. "I don't know anything right now, except that I want my daughter to live." "Then let's focus on that first. Everything else can wait." Dr. Brennan reappeared at the end of the corridor, his expression cautiously optimistic. "Mr. Westbrook, if you're ready, we should start the preliminary workup. There are forms to sign, final tests to run before tomorrow's procedure." Julian nodded, then turned back to Victoria. "Can I see her before the surgery?" Victoria hesitated. Penelope didn't know this man, had no idea who he was or what he meant to their lives. But something in Julian's eyes, the desperate hope, the barely contained grief, the love for a daughter he'd never known existed, made her decision. "Yes," she said. "Yes, you can see her." They walked together to the ICU entrance, past the hand sanitizer stations and the warning signs about infection control. Victoria pressed the button to open the automatic doors, and they stepped into the sterile, beeping world where her daughter fought for every breath. Penelope was awake now, her pale blue eyes open and watching the ceiling with the listless expression of someone too tired to be curious. When Victoria approached the bed, those eyes shifted, and a weak smile touched Penelope's cracked lips. "Hi, Mama," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Hi, sweetheart. I brought someone to meet you." Victoria gestured for Julian to come closer. He moved slowly, carefully, as if afraid he might break something precious. Penelope looked at Julian with mild interest. "Are you a new doctor?" "No," Julian said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm a friend of your mother's, and I'm going to help you get better." "Really?" A spark of hope lit Penelope's tired eyes. "You have medicine that works?" "Something like that." Julian reached out hesitantly, then stopped, looking at Victoria for permission. She nodded, and he gently took Penelope's small, cold hand in his much larger one. "You're going to be strong again soon, Penelope. Strong enough to paint and sing and run around like kids should." "I miss painting," Penelope said wistfully. "I was making a picture of butterflies before I got too sick. Mama says butterflies are symbols of transformation." Julian's grip on her hand tightened slightly, and Victoria saw tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. "Your mama is right. Butterflies are very special. And so are you." Penelope yawned, exhaustion pulling her back towards sleep. "Will you be here tomorrow?" "Yes," Julian promised. "I'll be here tomorrow, and the day after that, and as many days as you need me." "Okay," Penelope murmured, her eyes already closing. "That's nice." Within moments she was asleep again, her breathing shallow but steady. Julian stood frozen, still holding her hand, tears now streaming openly down his face. Victoria watched him, this powerful billionaire reduced to trembling emotion by the sight of a dying child, his child. "She has my mother's eyes," Julian whispered. "I never thought I'd see them again." Victoria placed her hand on his shoulder, and they stood together in silence. Two strangers bound by a shared past and an uncertain future, united in their determination to save the little girl who connected them. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Tomorrow would bring the surgery, the transplant, the beginning of Penelope's fight back to health. But tonight, for the first time in months, Victoria felt something other than despair. She felt hope. The surgery suite was colder than Julian had expected. He lay on the sterile table, dressed in a thin hospital gown, watching nurses prepare the equipment that would extract bone marrow from his hip. Dr. Brennan stood beside him, reviewing the procedure one final time. But Julian barely heard the words. His mind was 3 floors away, in the room where Penelope waited for the gift that would save her life. "Mr. Westbrook, you understand this will be painful," Dr. Brennan was saying. "The anesthesia will handle the worst of it, but recovery takes several days, and you'll experience significant discomfort." "I don't care about the pain," Julian said flatly. "Just get what she needs." The anesthesiologist approached with a needle, and Julian closed his eyes, letting the medication pull him under. His last conscious thought was of Christopher's face, wondering if his son somehow knew that his father was finally doing something that mattered, something that might redeem years of running from everything real. When he woke, the world was fuzzy, and his hip throbbed with a deep, grinding ache. A nurse leaned over him, checking his vitals, her voice soothing but distant. "The procedure went perfectly, Mr. Westbrook. The transplant team has already begun preparing your donation for Penelope." "How long?" Julian's voice came out rough, his throat dry. "They're taking her into surgery now. The transplant itself takes several hours. Dr. Brennan will update you as soon as there's news." The hours that followed blurred together in a haze of pain medication and fractured sleep. Julian drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes waking to find nurses checking his bandages, sometimes jerking awake from dreams of Christopher, of the hospital room where his son had taken his last breath. But in those dreams, something was different now. Christopher wasn't alone. Penelope was there too, both children laughing and playing in a field of wildflowers that stretched endlessly under a perfect blue sky. Christopher would look at Julian and smile, that radiant smile that had been absent in his final months, and he would say, "It's okay, Dad. You can let me go now. You have someone else to protect." Victoria appeared in Julian's recovery room late that evening. She looked even more exhausted than before, her eyes red-rimmed and haunted, but there was a tremulous smile on her face. "The transplant is done," she said, sinking into the chair beside his bed. "Penelope made it through the surgery." They said the next 72 hours are critical, but so far her body seems to be accepting the bone marrow. Julian tried to sit up, wincing at the sharp pain in his hip. Can I see her? Not yet. She's in isolation to prevent infection while her immune system rebuilds. But Dr. Brennan said if you're strong enough tomorrow, they can wheel you to her window. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Finally, Victoria spoke again, her voice quiet. I've been thinking about what you said, about Penelope being your daughter. I looked at her today, really looked at her, trying to see you in her features. And you're right. She has your eyes, your stubborn chin. Even the way she furrows her brow when she's concentrating. That's you. Does it scare you? Julian asked, knowing that I'm her father. Terrifies me, Victoria admitted, but not for the reasons you might think. I'm not afraid of you taking her away or trying to control our lives. I'm afraid of what happens if this doesn't work, if the transplant fails, if we lose her anyway, because now you've lost her too, even though you just found her. It's going to work, Julian said with fierce conviction. She's a fighter. I can see it in her, that same determination Christopher had. She's going to survive this. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. I want to believe that. God, I want to believe it so badly. Then believe it. Have faith. Julian reached out, taking her hand in his. The gesture felt natural, familiar, as if they'd done this 1,000 times before. We're going to get through this together. Over the next 3 days, Julian remained in the hospital despite his doctor's recommendations that he go home to recover. He refused to leave, spending his waking hours in a wheelchair outside Penelope's isolation room, watching her through the observation window. Victoria stayed by his side, and slowly, cautiously, they began to talk about everything they'd left unsaid 9 years ago. Victoria told him about her pregnancy, the morning sickness that lasted all day, the terror of facing motherhood alone. She described Trevor's initial kindness, how he'd seemed like a miracle, a man willing to raise another man's child. But she also talked about the cracks that appeared over the years, the resentment Trevor couldn't quite hide, the way he'd pulled away emotionally long before Penelope got sick. Julian shared the darker parts of his own story, his wife Rachel's descent into depression after Christopher's death, the way she'd blamed him for not finding a donor fast enough, for working too much, for failing to save their son. Their divorce had been bitter and public, splashed across tabloids that painted him as a cold-hearted businessman who'd chosen money over family. After Rachel left, I convinced myself that I was better off alone, Julian confessed. I threw myself into expanding the company, making deals, accumulating wealth I didn't need. I dated occasionally, but never anything serious, never anything that required me to actually feel something. And now? Victoria asked. Now I realize I've been half alive for 9 years. I've been so focused on not feeling pain that I stopped feeling anything at all. He looked at her intently. Until 3 weeks ago, when I saw Penelope's information and felt everything come flooding back. The grief, the fear, but also something else. Hope. The possibility that maybe I could have a second chance. On the 4th day, Dr. Brennan arrived with news that changed everything. His expression was grave as he approached them in the hallway, and Victoria's hand flew to her mouth, anticipating the worst. Penelope's body is rejecting the transplant, he said quietly. Her immune system is attacking the new bone marrow. We're administering immunosuppressants, but her condition is deteriorating rapidly. Victoria made a sound like a wounded animal. Julian gripped the arms of his wheelchair, his knuckles white. What are our options? We can try increasing the medication, hope her body adjusts, but honestly the odds aren't good. In cases like this, when rejection happens this quickly and aggressively, Dr. Brennan trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. No, Julian said, his voice hard as steel. There has to be something else, another treatment, another option. The doctor hesitated, then said, there is one possibility, but it's experimental and risky. A secondary infusion of donor lymphocytes, essentially more cells from you that might help modulate her immune response. But it could make things worse, could accelerate the rejection. What's the success rate? Victoria asked, her voice barely a whisper. In the few cases where it's been attempted, about 30%, but those are small numbers, not statistically significant. Julian didn't hesitate. Do it. Take whatever you need from me. Mr. Westbrook, you're still recovering from the first procedure. Another extraction so soon could cause serious complications for you. Infection, prolonged pain, damaged to the bone. "I don't care," Julian said fiercely. "If there's a 30% chance it saves her life, then we take it. Do it now." Dr. Brennan looked at Victoria, who nodded through her tears. "Do it," she echoed. They took Julian back to surgery that evening. This time he refused any sedation beyond local anesthesia, wanting to stay conscious, to feel every moment of what he was giving. The pain was extraordinary, a grinding, burning sensation that made him grip the table rails until his hands ached. But he welcomed it, embraced it even, because pain meant he was alive, meant he was doing something that mattered. When it was over, when they'd extracted what they needed, Julian was wheeled directly to Penelope's isolation room. Through the window he could see her small form in the bed, surrounded by machines that beeped warnings, that showed numbers trending in the wrong direction. Victoria stood pressed against the glass, her palm flat against it, as if she could somehow transmit her love through the barrier. Julian positioned his wheelchair beside her, and together they watched the medical team administer the lymphocyte infusion, watched the pale amber liquid flow through the IV into Penelope's fragile body. "Please work," Victoria whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "Please. Please work." Hours passed. Night deepened outside the hospital windows. Nurses came and went, checking monitors, adjusting medications, their faces carefully neutral. Dr. Brennan stayed with them, sitting in a chair across the hallway, his presence a silent show of support. At 3 in the morning, something changed. One of the monitors showed a subtle shift in Penelope's white blood cell count. Then another number improved, and another. The nurse inside the isolation room looked up sharply, checked the readings twice, then hurried to call Dr. Brennan. He studied the monitors intently, his expression transforming from cautious to cautiously hopeful. When he turned to Julian and Victoria, there were tears in his eyes. "Her body is responding," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The rejection is slowing. The lymphocytes are working." Victoria collapsed against Julian's wheelchair, sobbing with relief. He reached up and pulled her down, holding her as tightly as his weakened body would allow, both of them shaking with the force of emotions too powerful to contain. Inside the isolation room, Penelope's eyes fluttered open. She was too weak to move, too fragile to do more than breathe, but she was alive, and she was fighting. And for the first time in 9 years, Julian Westbrook allowed himself to believe in miracles. 3 months later, Victoria stood in the doorway of Penelope's hospital room and watched her daughter paint. Real paint this time, not the imaginary strokes of a child too weak to hold a brush. Penelope sat cross-legged on her bed, her hair growing back in soft blonde waves, her cheeks pink with health, her tongue poking out slightly, as she concentrated on capturing the perfect shade of blue for a butterfly's wing. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Victoria said, her heart swelling with gratitude that never seemed to diminish no matter how many days passed. Penelope looked up and grinned, that radiant smile that had been absent for so long. "Do you think Julian will like it? I'm making it for him, for his office." "I think he'll love it," Victoria assured her, though she suspected Julian would have treasured anything Penelope created, even a stick figure drawn in crayon. The past 3 months had been a journey none of them could have predicted. After the lymphocyte infusion worked its miracle, Penelope's recovery had been slow, but steady. The rejection reversed, the new bone marrow took hold, and gradually, day by day, her body began producing healthy blood cells again. The medical team called it remarkable. Dr. Brennan called it unprecedented. Victoria and Julian called it what it was, a second chance. But recovery wasn't just physical. As Penelope grew stronger, difficult conversations loomed. She'd ask questions about Julian, about why he visited every single day, why he looked at her with such intensity and tenderness. Victoria and Julian had agreed to wait until she was out of immediate danger before revealing the truth, but that day had finally arrived. Julian appeared in the doorway now, carrying a small wrapped package and wearing jeans and a casual sweater instead of his usual business attire. Over the past months, he'd stepped back from his company, delegating responsibilities to his executive team, choosing to spend his time in the hospital rather than in boardrooms. The change suited him. He looked younger somehow, lighter, despite the silver threading through his dark hair. "Special delivery," he announced, holding up the package. "For the finest artist in Chicago." Penelope squealed with delight, setting aside her painting carefully before bouncing on the bed. "What is it? Can I open it now?" "Of course." Julian handed her the gift, then glanced at Victoria. She nodded, her stomach tight with nervous anticipation. Today was the day. Dr. Brennan had cleared Penelope for discharge next week, and they'd all agreed she deserved to know the truth before she left the hospital. Penelope tore into the wrapping paper, revealing a beautifully crafted wooden box with brass hinges. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a complete set of professional-grade watercolor paints, brushes of every size and thick sheets of premium paper. "Oh!" Penelope breathed, her eyes wide. "Julian, this is too much. These are real artist supplies." "For a real artist," Julian said, sitting on the edge of her bed. "I thought you might need them for all the paintings you're going to create when you get home." Penelope threw her arms around his neck, hugging him fiercely. Julian closed his eyes, wrapping his arms around her small frame, and Victoria saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. When Penelope pulled back, she was beaming, but Julian's expression had turned serious. "Penelope, there's something your mother and I need to talk to you about," he said gently. "Something important." The little girl's smile faded slightly, replaced by curiosity and a hint of concern. "Am I in trouble?" "No, sweetheart, nothing like that," Victoria said quickly, moving to sit on the other side of the bed. She took Penelope's hand, feeling its warmth, marveling at the strength in fingers that had been so cold and weak just months ago. "Remember how we talked about how you got sick and how you needed bone marrow from someone special to get better?" Penelope nodded. "You said only one person in the whole world could save me, and they said yes." "That's right." Victoria glanced at Julian, drawing courage from his steady gaze. "That person was Julian. His bone marrow was a perfect match for yours." "Really?" Penelope looked at Julian with new wonder. "You're the one who saved me." "Yes," Julian said softly. "But there's a reason why my bone marrow matched yours so perfectly, Penelope. It's because we're related. We share the same DNA. The same genetic code." Penelope frowned, trying to puzzle it out. "Like cousins?" "No, sweetheart," Victoria said, her voice trembling. "Closer than that. Julian is your biological father. Your real father." The room fell silent, except for the quiet hum of the heating system. Penelope looked from Victoria to Julian and back again, processing this information with the serious expression she got when working through complex problems. "But Trevor is my dad," she said finally, though there was uncertainty in her voice. "Isn't he? Trevor helped raise you and he cared about you," Victoria said carefully, "but he wasn't your biological father. Julian and I met a long time ago before you were born, but we lost touch with each other. I didn't know how to find him, and he didn't know about you, not until you got sick and the hospital found him as your donor match." Penelope turned to Julian, studying his face with an intensity that reminded Victoria eerily of Julian himself. "You didn't know about me?" "No," Julian said, his voice rough with emotion. "But the moment I found out, the moment I knew you existed, you became the most important person in my world. And I will spend the rest of my life making up for the 8 years I missed." "Trevor left when I got sick," Penelope said quietly. "He said goodbye and never came back. Mama cried a lot." Julian's jaw clenched, anger flashing in his eyes before he controlled it. "I'm sorry he did that to you, but I promise you, Penelope, I will never leave. Not when things get hard, not ever. You're stuck with me now if you'll have me." Penelope was quiet for a long moment, her young mind working through implications that would challenge even an adult. Then she asked, "Can I call you Dad?" Julian's composure shattered. Tears streamed down his face as he nodded, unable to speak. Penelope crawled across the bed and into his arms, and he held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, which to him she was. "I had a brother, didn't I?" Penelope asked, her voice muffled against Julian's chest. "Christopher. You talk about him sometimes when you think I'm asleep." Julian looked at Victoria in surprise. She shook her head slightly. She hadn't told Penelope about Christopher. Their daughter had figured it out on her own. "Yes," Julian managed. "You had a brother. He died when he was 7, before you were born. He was sick like you were, but we couldn't find a donor to save him." Penelope pulled back to look at Julian's face. "But you saved me. That means something good came from something sad." The simple wisdom of her words struck them both. Victoria reached out and took Julian's free hand, and the three of them sat together in that hospital room. A family forged not by conventional means, but by suffering, sacrifice, and the stubborn refusal to give up hope. Dr. Brennan arrived an hour later with Penelope's discharge papers. "Next week she goes home," he said, beaming. "Full recovery expected. This is exactly the outcome we hoped for." "Where is home?" Penelope asked, looking between Victoria and Julian. Are we still living in our apartment? Victoria hesitated. Their small two-bedroom apartment had been adequate, but barely. The medical bills had devastated her savings, and she'd lost her job months ago due to missing so much work. She'd been trying not to think about the financial reality waiting for them outside the hospital walls. Actually, Julian said, I was hoping you might both consider moving into my house. It's big, probably too big for one person, and it has a room with perfect northern light that would make an excellent art studio. Julian, we can't, Victoria began. Yes, you can, he interrupted gently. Penelope is my daughter. He paused, searching for the right words. You're the woman I should have spent the last 9 years with if I hadn't been too broken and afraid to stay. I'm not asking you to marry me or commit to anything you're not ready for. I'm just asking you to let me be part of your lives, to let me take care of my family the way I should have been doing all along. Victoria looked at Penelope, whose eyes were bright with hope. Can we, Mama? Can we live with Dad? The word Dad from Penelope's lips, so natural already, made Victoria's decision easy. Yes, she said. Yes, we can try. The day Penelope was discharged, Julian carried her out of the hospital himself, refusing a wheelchair, wanting to feel her weight in his arms, solid and real and alive. Photographers had somehow gotten wind of the story. Billionaire saves daughter he never knew existed, and cameras flashed as they emerged into the bright autumn sunshine. But Julian didn't care about the publicity, didn't care about the headlines that would run in tomorrow's papers. He cared only about the little girl in his arms, who was chattering excitedly about painting in her new studio, and the woman walking beside him who'd given him a second chance at fatherhood, at love, at life itself. 6 months later, on a spring morning filled with the scent of blooming flowers, Julian and Victoria stood in the garden behind his house, their house now, and watched Penelope chase butterflies through the grass. Her hair had grown long again, thick and healthy, and her laughter rang out like music. She wants to enter her butterfly painting in the children's art show at the museum, Victoria said, leaning against Julian's shoulder. Dr. Brennan helped her apply. She'll win, Julian said confidently. She has real talent. She has your determination, Victoria countered, and your heart. Julian turned to face her, cupping her cheek in his palm. Over the past months, their relationship had deepened slowly, carefully, building on the foundation of shared crisis and emerging into something neither had expected, genuine love. Not the desperate, grief-fueled connection of 9 years ago, but something mature and lasting. Marry me, he said simply. Not because of Penelope, not because it makes practical sense, but because I love you, because I want to spend every day of the rest of my life with you. Victoria smiled, tears gathering in her eyes, happy tears this time. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Penelope looked up from her butterfly chase and saw them kissing. She wrinkled her nose in exaggerated disgust, then grinned and ran toward them, launching herself into their embrace. The three of them stood together in the garden, wrapped in each other's arms, a family built from loss and found through the most unlikely of miracles. Julian thought of Christopher, hoped his son knew that his father had finally found his way back to living, back to loving. And somewhere in the distance, a butterfly, brilliant blue and impossibly beautiful, rose into the sky, spiraling upward toward the sun.